Doctors, what is the most unethical thing you have done or heard about? From a patient perspective, I still have trouble with this one. I was getting a severe wound on my shin cleaned of debris with a scrub brush. The doctor, for some reason, wasn't wearing any face protection and managed to splash wound juice into her mouth. Her response was a PFFBD, PLBBFT, PBFFFTT. I got your juices in my mouth. I was horrified. Never returned. Edit. Poor diction. Smiley face. My roommate in dental school was a medical student. There was some big scandal at the hospital he was doing a rotation at because an anesthesiologist left the OR with a nurse anesthetist and left the patient alone. Something went wrong, and the patient passed away on the table. Where were the two of them? Getting down in a nearby and used room, thinking that nothing could happen in just a few minutes. I briefly worked at the front desk clerk for an ER at a local hospital. The rule was that anyone that came in complaining of chest pains had to be back and on a machine within 10 minutes of arrival. Once I entered their name into the system, a clock started. So I was told not to enter their name until they had already been taken back to essentially make our numbers look better and make it appear as though they were receiving care within the prescribed 10 minutes. Edit. People complaining of chest pains were typically brought back quickly, just not always within the 10-minute guideline, although generally faster than anyone else. This mostly seemed to be just about producing better stats, although keeping it off the system gave them the ability to delay. There are three kinds of lies in the world: lies, damned lies, and statistics. My opinion, never trust an individual stat. They're almost always manipulated, and if you have chest pains, take aspirin. Did the same kind of thing when I used to work at Burger King. When it was slow, I'd get in my car, order a water, then drive around and do it over and over again so our times would look better. But yeah, this is different. It was in the news here, but there was a surgeon in Birmingham, I think, who diathermed essentially burned his initials onto patients' livers. My colleague worked with him and saw him do this. I personally haven't seen much that's too bad. There are a lot of pretty dark jokes in the doctor's office, but nothing potentially damaging. A nurse did once offer to give me unprescribed flucloxacillin for a skin infection, but I politely refused. Veterinarian. I've worked with clients to hide abused dogs that were rescued from their mean owners until a shelter was located. I wasn't expecting this unethical act to be so well received. Thank you for all your kind words and for the gold. As long as I have a place to put an unwanted pet, I will continue to do what I can. Thank you to you all who have already adopted from a shelter or have taken in a stray. Even if you have paid a lot for your pet, as long as you love it and take good care of it, that's what we should strive for as humans. In the hospital I work at, there are many frequent flyer psychiatric patients. They usually have very serious social issues, e.g., lack of housing, no money, etc. Sometimes, when the psych unit gets tired of them, they buy them a bus ticket and send them somewhere far away so that they'll be someone else's problem. My mom is a nurse that worked at a hospice. She was known among the other nurses as having a gift. When it was coming time for a patient to reach his or her end, my mom would be able to guess the time of death, usually within 5 to 10 minutes. The nurses would make betting pools and really were fascinated by what my mom could do. They would tip her off on a patient in bad condition, and she would go in and take their temperature, feel the feet, and check their pulse and walk out with an exact time. She won a lot of money and free lunches in her stay there. When a higher management official approached her one day about it, she immediately started to apologize for her unprofessionalism. The manager stopped her and told her she was in fact impressed by her ability. Pro tip: check the medical license history through your state medical board before going to a DR. Some of the disciplinary action is no big deal, failure to properly document things, but I've seen some really crazy things. For instance, one surgeon had repeatedly performed gallstone removal on patients without actually doing anything. The doctor was cutting people open, pretending to remove stones, and just placing the same set of stones from a previous surgery in a container, and then sewing people back up. He did this to several patients before a group of or nurses caught on and turned him into the board. The guy still has a license to practice. Edit. People are calling BS on this. It happened a while back. Not sure if I'll be able to link to the medical board disciplinary letters, but I'm definitely not making it up. I'll try to find the info because it definitely happened. Also, if he was never performing the surgery anyway, it would make sense that he was faking it completely different than how the surgery is actually performed. As a pharmacist, I will sometimes call docs on drug interactions. The other day, the ER doc I talked to had never heard of the interaction I was calling on and said to tell the patient to take the meds. I guess since you haven't heard of it, it must not be a thing. The ego on some of these guys is insane. This was really a misunderstanding, but in college I thought I had an STD. That turned out to be a recurring case of a yeast infection I got from some fine young lady. The culture would come out negative for any STD, but the symptoms would return. The college DR was a woman, and after my third time to return to tell her the symptoms were back, even though the tests were negative and I had taken all the meds, she turned me away because she thought I had a weird fetish of her giving my Johnson a culture test. Interns are not supposed to be in the hospital alone. It is a requirement for all residency programs. There should always be a senior resident or faculty member in-house. This is with good reason because interns lack experience. When I was a brand new intern, a senior resident that I was working with regularly used to go home in the middle of night shift and leave me to cover everything. She would come back right before morning rounds. She was an awful resident who had many problems along the way, but somehow she ended up in a very nice, high-paying job. So people fail upwards. An interesting moral quandary my father, an oncologist, encountered. He had just given a patient a very bad diagnosis, something very much terminal, and not much time left to live. The guy said he was going to go on a spending spree with all his credit cards and gift away a lot of the stuff to loved ones. My dad confides that he technically had an obligation to report such information to credit bureaus or whatever, but after a little thought figured, what the hell, let the dying guy have his day. What does Reddit think of this? I'm not a doctor, but a friend of mine's dad got diagnosed with colon cancer a while ago. They treated that, and then the cancer spread to his liver. He had an operation to remove 60% of his liver, but not too long after the procedure, they found cancer in his lungs. But here's the twisted part. He went to a different cancer center following the procedure, and they found that he had cancer in his lungs all along. That's right. It said on file that the hospital he went to previously knew he had colon and lung cancer at the same time for 3 months, and were never going to tell him. They intentionally were keeping it from him. The man is interested in pursuing a lawsuit. I, for one, think the whole situation is awful. The cancer center said, had they treated the colon and lungs at the same time, he would have been better. When I was a young kid and first discovering the joys of Google, I thought it would be fun to search my surgeon father's name. One of the first results led me to a tabloid article about a nurse who was operating within his department, who kept killing off patients in some twisted angel of death, perceived mercy killings. I was 9. So a few years ago, I went to the walk-in doctor because I thought I had chlamydia. Doctor took a quick look and came to the same diagnosis and wrote me a prescription for some sort of antibiotic. Then he's like, actually, I might have some left over from another patient, and proceeds to go into his drawer, pull out a bottle full of the right pills, and hands them to me. Take one a day for the next week. I walk out and look at the orange bottle and see that it still has the previous patient's label on it, including their full name. That walk-in clinic was closed down about a year later. I can't imagine why. Not me, but an old family friend. Back in the 90s, he was a well-renowned heart surgeon in Japan. One day, the local Yakuza boss came in for new heart, but there was a mistake and the Yakuza boss died on the operating table. Our family friend was scared for his life, so he ran away to America in a fishing boat. Don't feel too bad for him, though. He's doing pretty well off here in the States. While he's no longer practicing medicine, he has a decent paying job, thanks to some hookups from my old man. He even found himself a nice American wife. But you know what his big secret is? He screwed up the surgery on purpose. He's a good surgeon, the best. I work as a surgical tech in a small hospital, and I can say is that C-sections are brutal. They tear muscle out of the way and scar a woman's anatomy, which could make her next baby dangerous to deliver vaginally. So she would be less at risk to have another C-section. Sometimes we get women who have previously had a C-section in Mexico, and her anatomy is messed up a bit from their last one. As a woman, I can tell you that I would never electively have a C-section unless it was medically necessary. My personal opinion, not so the doctor could make it to dinner or a golf game or whatever. We have a ridiculously high C-section rate at our little hospital, so this threat hit home to me. All I can say is educate yourself. Don't just trust your doc. I'm not a doctor yet, but when I was shadowing a doctor, I went with her to a malpractice risk management meeting. The entire meeting was about how to cover up malpractice by shifting the blame on each other so no one can get sued, how to avoid testifying against each other in court, and how to use messy handwriting when filling out documents so if it does go to court, the evidence is hard to interpret. It even used dozens of examples of cases from the hospital that were actual malpractice, but the patient never got compensated because of the risk management techniques used to avoid being sued. That meeting absolutely horrified me. The funny thing is most people think it's easy to sue a doctor for even genuine malpractice. It isn't. My school psychologist improperly diagnosed me. I was kicked out of my high school as a kid for being mentally disturbed when I wasn't. The people in charge of the school just wanted to get rid of me. I eventually got to go back after I consulted my own doc, and if my family had any money, we'd have sued the school. Because people are rightfully freaking out over the horrible number of horror stories. I'll share this. Grew up with a family where the father was a doctor. Most hardworking, nicest guy you'd ever meet. regularly gives consultations in his off time to people he knows or who know people who know him, who don't have health insurance, so they don't have to pay insane amounts of money for a doctor visit. Despite having been named one of San Diego's best doctors 15 years running, against the suggestions of his peers to take a cushy, better-paying, easier job, he stays on as an ER resident because he can do more good there. He's been ostracized at his old hospital for turning in one of the hospital's most personally beloved DRS for writing scripts to his drug-addicted wife after he refused to stop. When particularly scared kids would come through the ER and then get admitted, he's been known to visit them when his shift ends to read them Harry Potter. DRS can be scary and incompetent, but they can also be great and caring too. This is pretty much how I was born. Game number 1 of the World Series was scheduled for 8 p.m. that evening. The doctor was a big baseball fan, and our city's team had made the series for the first time many, many years. I was born via C-section at 7:53 p.m. Edit. I am highly entertained by these guesses. So far, people have assumed that I am anywhere from 6 months old to 40 years old. Here's a hint. I am somewhere in between those ages. When I worked in OB, we had a physician who continuously did this. Had his own private practice and partners to take over for him. Like being home for dinner every night. We also had an OB who refused to come in for a delivery because it was raining outside. Keep in mind, this was in Michigan, which means that every winter we get absolutely dumped with snow and ice December through March, but, rain. When my mom was pregnant with my little brother, the doctor induced her 2 days early, so that way he could go on a ski trip. While I didn't realize this made international headlines, I'm also from LI. This is such a wild story though, so I'm not surprised. You have to wonder how someone housed from going to medical school and swearing to do no harm to this level of insanity. I'm sure this story will continue to unfold for a while. Son of Pakistani hospital administrator here. What you're talking about is probably how things are in rural Pakistan, but if you're anywhere near urban Pakistan, you can get access to proper healthcare in a private hospital and even some good government hospitals. It's all about how smart you are. My doctor tried to do this to me as well. I was due on December 23rd, and he came up with some BS reason as to why I should have a C-section a week and a half before my due date. I noped my way out of his office and had a smooth delivery a week later with some random on-call DR. I am so glad I didn't fall for it. Thank you. Every time I bring this up in threads about childbirth, I get downvoted to all hell. Educate yourselves, people. The Thinking Woman's Guide to a Better Birth was a great help for me when I was pregnant, in case that info is helpful to anyone reading this. Edit. Apparently TTWGTVB is uneducated and pandering. Someone ITT recommended the ACOG website instead. Use whatever you want. Just don't be afraid to try to be informed and ask your healthcare provider questions. If they're good at their job, they'll answer you the best they can. This is super common. I was born via cesarean at 6:35 a.m. My mom's OBGYN refused to come in before 6:30, so my poor mom was in labor with a breech baby who wasn't going anywhere for at least 6 hours. The residents were to deliver in an emergency, but the OB was not to be bothered between 6:30 p.m. and 6:30 a.m. That's fucked up. Why even be an OB then? They know they will be on call going into that particular specialty. Happens all the time. Was doing an OB round, and all the nurses started shitting on one of the OB groups in town. They have a patient show up to be induced, who they clearly thought should not be induced. My next clinical rotation, and a young woman is in labor for about an hour before the doc shows up from the time I was there to when the doc showed, but it was a clusterfuck. In walks a doc from this group, takes one look at the fetal heart monitor, and says the baby cannot tolerate labor, and she needed a C-section. All the nurses just short of shrugged their shoulders and said, "Told you so." It was scary. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.